A Song for Silas by Laurie Wick, Chapter 26. 48 hours after Grant had uttered those devastating words, Amy was on the verge of panic. Trying not to pace, she waited for Silas to come from her father's bedroom, but she couldn't sit still. The night Evan visited, Grant had briefly told them what he'd come to say. Evidently, in a panic, about half of the bank patrons had come in on Monday morning demanding their money. A few were large depositors. If not for those, the bank would have stood its own. As it was, Grant felt Evan had panicked a little himself by calling Grant's loan and 2 others. After some discussion Monday night, the subject had been dropped. Now Amy waited for Silas, who had gone into Grant's room after supper to see if something could be worked out. When he appeared in the kitchen, Amy was seated. She frantically wrung her hands and asked, "Is Dad okay?" Silas was surprised at her state of agitation. He had not realized how upset she was. "Oh, Silas, what are we to do? What was Uncle Evan thinking? We don't have money put aside to pay off that loan. Does he think we're hiding it in our mattresses?" "Amy, try to calm down. I need to tell you something." "Calm? You want me to be calm? The only home I've ever known is about to be taken from me, and you ask me to be calm?" "But Amy, if you would just listen. Your dad and I have talked, and I'd like to tell you if you would just simmer down." "Silas, you never answered my question. Is Dad okay?" "Oh, never mind. I'll go check on him myself." Silas caught her at the door. "Amy, come back to the table and let me talk to you. I didn't realize you were so upset." "You didn't realize I was upset?" She nearly shouted at him as he led her back into the room. "Well, what did you think I'd be with all that's happened?" Amy's words were abruptly cut off, as Silas snatched her into his arms and covered her mouth firmly with his own. The kiss was not short, and Silas felt Amy go limp in his arms as his lips tenderly held hers. Amy gasped when Silas broke the kiss, and her eyes rivaled the moon for size. While still holding her, Silas's soft, deep voice broke into the now quiet kitchen. "If you will just sit down and stay quiet for a moment, I'll tell you about my conversation with your dad." On Amy's nod, Silas released her and sat at the table. Silas took a chair near hers. "Your dad and I have talked, and I offered him what I have in my savings. It's not the full amount of the loan, but close enough that I think Evan will take it. We've still got a few days, so your dad wants to think and pray on it some more." Amy was moved nearly to tears and still in shock over what had just transpired, but she managed to say, "Thank you, Silas," in a small voice. They sat in silence then. Silas studied his hands, his face expressionless. He looked up to find Amy concentrating on his mouth, and he spoke without thinking. "Did Thomas ever kiss you?" Amy jerked as though struck and turned red. "Yes, twice, after we were married." Amy realized she was stuttering and stopped in painful embarrassment, but Silas still looked at her, and she wished she knew what he was thinking. A terrible thought coming to her, Amy asked in a harsh whisper, "Silas, are you disgusted with me? Do you think I'm cheap for kissing Thomas?" Pain slashed across Silas's features at her words, and his voice was rough with emotion. "Never, Amy, would I think you cheap. It's only natural that you kiss the man you expect to marry." Amy was so relieved that she nearly wept. She could not have stood it if Silas was repulsed by her. The silence between them lengthened and grew uncomfortable. Finally, Amy asked, "Would you like some coffee or anything?" "No, thanks. I think I'll go and check the herd and then turn in." He spoke the words softly, and for the first time did not attempt to hide what was in his heart. Amy's own heart thumped furiously at what she read in his eyes. For just an instant their eyes held, and then Silas pushed away from the table and strode toward the door. Grant listened in alarm as Amy's raised voice came from the other room. Silas said something in return, but Grant couldn't make out the words. Grant froze as Amy's voice nearly raised to a shout before all went completely quiet. He continued to listen, and after a while heard the front door open and close. Grant relaxed back against the pillows, a smile on his face. If he were a betting man, he'd place money on the fact that Amy had just been kissed. He wondered how rough the road ahead would be. It was only a matter of time until Amy stopped mothering him and saw that the man she needed most was sitting beneath her nose. And Silas was probably sure he had just been sent by God to work in the fields, figuring Amy would never return his love. Well, Grant knew he could not interfere. God would lead the way. But please, Lord, he prayed, let me be on my feet to walk her down the aisle. You're a fool, Silas Cameron, the biggest fool to ever live. Silas had been saying these words, and worse, for the past 2 hours. He had every line and splinter on the ceiling memorized as he lay in bed. He should not have been trying to think at all, for he was exhausted physically as well as emotionally. Weeks of working in the fields were taking their toll. Silas was beginning to think the life of a horse breeder was a life of ease. He was sure Luke would argue that point, since he was carrying all the weight and had been for many weeks. It was time to go home. The planting was done, and as soon as they worked out the money details, there would be no reason to stay. The savings would be missed. Silas had been praying about building his own home this summer, but Grant and Amy needed the money more. And since he didn't have a wife and kids, he had no real need for a home of his own. No home or family of his own. That was the real reason he had to go. He had all but told Amy of his feelings. There was no way she would be comfortable around him now. At least before they had shared a friendship, but now he was even unsure of that. Amy had made her feelings quite clear about marriage and her home here. She was more than a little attached to this farm, perhaps too much so, but he wouldn't want to take her away if she didn't want to go. Silas lay awake for a long time, thinking and praying. It was clear to him he had been used of God in the lives of these people, and for this he was thankful. But he was human, with human emotions, and was saddened at knowing his heart belonged to a woman who could not give hers in return. It was a long time before Silas fell asleep. Her hand going to her mouth continually, Amy could still feel Silas's kiss. Thomas had kissed her twice, once passionately, but nothing had ever prepared her for being in the arms of Silas Cameron. Amy felt herself blushing with the remembrance. Burying her face in the pillow, she could still see his eyes. "He's in love with me." The words were muffled and indistinct. "But he can't love me," she tried to reason with herself. "I'm like a little sister to him. Somewhere along the line, those feelings must have changed. And what about my feelings? His kiss made me feel like I was melting. But we're just friends. Can good friends fall in love? I don't know. Well, it doesn't matter," she reasoned suddenly. "I have to stay here and take care of my dad. If I was in love with Silas, he would want to take me to Baxter, and my dad needs me here. Do not build your life around me." Unbidden, her father's selfless words came to mind, but Amy pushed them away. He was just saying that. This was her home, and he needed her here. Amy snuggled deep into the covers with a contented sigh. It was going to be hard to have Silas's feelings stronger than her own, but this was where she was supposed to be, she was sure. Amy fell asleep without remembering to open her Bible. In fact, in all her logic, Amy didn't check with God at all.